guys. So yes, my name is Dick Bertrand. My wife is Lindsay back there, so we like to help, and Kevin's graciously allowed me to come up here. So I will start by asking a question. So how many of us as Christians feel, and actually this was inspired by you mentioned it at one heart, feel like a pressure that as a Christian we can't make a mistake, or we have to be perfect, or we're letting God down if we sin or something. Anybody feel that way? So that's what's inspired this this message that I'm going to talk about. We're going to talk about who the Bible describes as a man after God's own heart, which is anybody? Anybody? No? I can't say. King David. So, additionally, you'll find that there's a lot of Bible verses in here, but the last time I was up here, I encouraged you guys all to do your own homework and make sure that you are evaluating what I'm saying and making sure that it matches up with what the Word says. So that's why I provided a lot of those things. So we'll buzz over some of that. Summer, if you want to go to the first one there for me. So the first one is just Acts 13:22, which is just confirming what I'm saying, that the Bible mentions that David was a man after God's own heart. Right there. He will do everything I want him to do. So we'll talk about King David, and obviously he's a great example because the Bible describes him as a man after God's own heart, but at the same time, he had a lot of flaws and a lot of issues that he worked through. What I also want you guys to think about and consider is how he dealt with those screw-ups that he made. How did he approach that, and what kind of attitude did he come before God with? So the first thing we'll talk about is obviously the story that everybody knows, David and Goliath. So go ahead, Summer. So this next series of verses here is the statement that David speaks to Goliath after Saul is telling him he can't do it. He tries to put his armor on. He tries to make him into something that he's not. And so just as an example, Zeke, now, come up there for me. Right here, brother. So obviously I'm not Goliath and Zeke isn't David, but you can kind of see the size difference that's here. How old is he? 11. Okay, so based on what I've done some research on it, Kevin, correct me if I'm wrong, David, probably somewhere in the area 13, 14, 15? Yep. When he's going and facing Goliath. And so we'll see, look at the amount of faith that he is showing here. When he's going, picture Zeke as David and me as Goliath. And so he is saying these things to someone that is obviously trained in war his whole life as well. So David replied to the Philistine, "You come to me with sword, spear, and javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of heaven's armies, the God of the armies of Israel, who you have defied." Next one, Summer. "Today the Lord will conquer you, and I will kill you and cut off your head. And then I will give the dead bodies of your men to the birds and wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel." Next one. "And everyone assembled here will know that the Lord rescues his people, but not with sword and spear. This is the Lord's battle. He will do the best." So, can any of you imagine Zeke saying that to me? Who's going to put money on Zeke winning? You? All right. Excellent. Excellent amount of faith there. Thank you, Zeke. So just to kind of put it into context. So that's kind of a good example of what David is demonstrating to us as a faith in God. He's going in there, he knows, and obviously we know how the story plays out. He kills David, hits him with the sling and the stone, knocks him out, and then the armies of the Philistines scattered. There's several more examples, but obviously I'm trying to limit my time here on this. So now we're moving on to some flaws that David had. So we're moving into, David has now become king. He's king of Israel, and he is asking in 2 Samuel 24:2, Summer. So David's over his army now, and he's asking one of his commanders, Joab, to take a census. Does anybody not know what a census is? All right, you all know what a census is. So David's saying, take a census of all the tribes of Israel, from Dan in the north to Beersheba in the south. So he's saying, I may know how many people are there. Why would he do that? Anybody? You think David was testing his faith? Or, okay. Anybody else? I don't think that's quite the case there. I think he's coming from a position of pride. So he wants to know how much stuff he has. Would you agree? So he's kind of looking at things and saying, look at all the stuff that I have. Look at my kingdom and how great it is. And if we read a little bit more further in those verses, Joab tells him this isn't a good idea, this is not what you should be doing. He tries to give him counsel. David says, go ahead and do it anyway. So the census is taken. Then God rebukes him a little bit later on in 2 Samuel 24, verse 10 through 17. But we'll read specifically from verse 17. But what we're finding here is that God approaches David and says, hey, you screwed up, you shouldn't have done this. Now I'm going to leave it to you. What do you think your punishment should be for this sin of pride? And you can either have X, Y, or Z. And David says, I don't want to be subject to the punishments of man. I want what your punishment is going to be for me, God. And so God puts a plague over the people. A lot of people die as a result of this sin of pride. And so now we're seeing how David is reacting to that mistake that he made. When David saw the angel, he said to the Lord, I am the one who has sinned and done wrong. But these people are as innocent as sheep. What have they done? Let your anger fall against me and my family. So he is recognizing that he's the one that screwed up, and he's trying to take responsibility for those actions. And that's a lesson that all of us can take. If you feel that pride swelling up in you, recognize that I need to pull back and humble myself a little bit. So now we're moving on to a different type of sin and temptation that he succumbed to. So go ahead, Summer. 2 Samuel 11:1. In the spring of the year, when kings normally go out to war, David sent Joab and the Israelite army to fight the Ammonites. They destroyed the Ammonite army and laid siege to the city of Rabbah. However, David stayed behind in Jerusalem. So we'll see that David will see the wife of somebody else, one of his soldiers, Uriah the Hittite. Her name is Bathsheba. He sees her, he desires her, he brings her to him. He ends up sleeping with her and gets her pregnant. And then she tells him, hey, I'm pregnant with a kid. So then he brings Uriah back from the battlefield and tries to make him go back and be with his wife as well so he can kind of cover up his sin. And nobody will be the wiser, but that doesn't work because Uriah turns out to be a man of more honor than David at the time. I'm not going to sleep with my wife. I'm going to sleep on the stoop, basically, because everybody else is out there still fighting. He tries and he tries, so then David conspires with Joab, I believe, to put Uriah up in the front where the fighting is the heaviest so that he ends up dying, and that's exactly what happens. So Uriah ends up dying. David then takes Bathsheba to be his wife, and then Prophet Nathan comes and confronts him and gives him an example of somebody that stole, a rich man that stole the poor person's, their one and only sheep, their one and only possession. David gets furious about it, obviously, because he doesn't realize it's about him. And then Nathan points out and said, you're the king, you're the guy that did this. So the other reason I mentioned verse 11, verse 1 here, and leave it up here, is because young men specifically, we're wired differently than women as far as the visual temptation that we have. And if you're not either spiritually and mentally prepared for a temptation when you're by yourself and you have something like this with you, access to the internet, Instagram, whatever, you're not going to be ready for that. So prepare yourself. And also, David wasn't doing what he was supposed to be doing. So just things to keep in mind, gentlemen. And so now we're going to see, and jumping forward to the other thing actually I wanted to mention too, go ahead, some of the next one here. David's census showed us that he had roughly 1.3 million soldiers at his disposal at the time. But the one gentleman that was here, again, Uriah the Hittite, was one of his 37 mighty men. He specifically mentioned there. So what do you think that can tell us about the relationship that David probably had with Uriah? Anybody? Yes, exactly. You don't get to be one of the 37 mighty men out of 1.3 million soldiers unless you are really good at what you do, and the king probably had a personal relationship with him. So that makes this circumstance all the more troubling, at the very least, because David knew who he was, I would gather, that we can kind of speculate on that. All right, so now we've talked about the David getting called on it. So there's a child that's been created as a result of this union of David and Bathsheba. And go ahead to the next one, Summer. So the whole section is verse 2 Samuel 12, 15 through 23. David is mourning and he's fasting and he's weeping and trying trust that God is going to allow this child to live. I believe he's already been told that the child is not going to make it as a result of this. But we see here that the child ends up passing away, and David is all of a sudden gone from being sorrowful, so he gets up, he cleans himself up, he eats, and his advisors don't understand why he's doing this. His advisors were amazed. We don't understand you. They told him, while the child was still living, you wept and refused to eat. But now that the child is dead, you have stopped your mourning and are eating again. Next one. David replied, I fasted and wept while the child was alive, for I said, perhaps the Lord will be gracious to me and let the child live. So David, is accepting God's result for this outcome. Obviously, the death of the child is a tragic thing, and I don't have really a good explanation as to why that would be the lesson that the Lord would use to teach him that. But that's where we are with that. So moving on to, we can also get a good look at David's heart for this exact incident because of Psalm 51. And the whole psalm itself is very good, but we'll just zero in on Psalm 51, verse 10. Create in me a clean heart, O God, renew a loyal spirit within me. So the whole psalm is you look at the title of it, it's based on when David was called out with Bathsheba, and so he's saying that I repent and I am so sorry that this happened, basically. And he's asking God to create a new heart in him. So we have David, the man full of pride, David, the man full of sin of the flesh, of the eyes. But David was also a man that wrote somewhere in the area of half the Psalms in the Bible. 75 is what I was figuring out. So the last example that I have here is from 2 Samuel 7, verse 12 through 17. So what we're seeing here is God is revealing to David that his household is going to live forever, and kind of prophesying the coming of the Messiah as well. It alludes to Solomon, but also it kind of talks forward, his kingdom will never end. And so, seeing that David has made all those mistakes, God still wants to use him, bless him, and is promising him these things. And so then we see David's response to all that in 2 Samuel 7, verse 18 through 28. I just took a couple snippets out of it, but you can see in that whole section there, David is basically saying, I'm just your servant. What more can I say to you? You know what your servant is really like, sovereign Lord. Next one. Because of your promise and according to your will, you have done all these great things and have made them known to your servant. David calls himself the Lord's servant, I believe 10 times in this little section here. So he is not uplifting himself. He's not being prideful about any of it. We have one more slide. How great you are, O sovereign Lord. There is none like you. We have never even heard of another God like you. I believe that's it. Right, Summer? All right. So, the main thing I want you guys to take away from this is you don't have to be perfect. God will use imperfect people to further his will and move forward his cause. But at the same time, we want to make sure that we have the right attitude about your mistakes as well. It's not, I made some mistake, that's just the way it's going to be. David was still striving to seek God and chase after him and just find him. And also that level of humility when God does use you. So, and then the other thing is if, you can use this as an example, because what's a very common thing that people will say to us, God can't save me, God can't use me, you don't know what I've done. That's a very common thing for people to hear. They think that God can't forgive them for whatever sin it is. I mean, we obviously see some pretty terrible examples here, an adulterer, a murderer, a very prideful person that had a lot of things going on. But still, that's God calls him a man after his own heart. So that's what I have for you guys. I appreciate you listening and appreciate your time. So.
Man, that's such a good message. That's so good. If Jesus was standing right here, okay, we're in church where the Spirit of the Lord is, there's freedom. We always believe Jesus lives inside of us for those that are born again. If Jesus was standing in this room and he came to Colton and he said, Colton,